The $20 bill trembled in Brynn Caldwell's fingers as she slipped it into her apron pocket. She'd found it wedged between the cushions of booth 7, the same booth where tech mogul Holden Kingsley held his weekly power lunches. The dining room had emptied except for his table, where he sat scrolling through his phone, platinum watch catching the afternoon light. "Excuse me." His voice cut through the silence like glass. Brynn turned, her heart already sinking. "I saw you take something from that table." The accusation hung in the air between them. Billionaire versus Waitress, power versus vulnerability. Brynn's throat constricted. She could feel the eyes of the remaining staff, could sense her manager approaching from the kitchen. This moment would define everything: her job, her reputation, her future. What Holden Kingsley didn't know was that this wasn't just about $20. It was about justice. The tension in that upscale Manhattan restaurant could have been felt from anywhere, whether you're watching from New York, Los Angeles, or wherever you call home. Power plays like this happen everywhere, but some battles run deeper than they appear on the surface. The late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian, casting golden shadows across the polished marble floors. Brynn Caldwell moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, her black uniform crisp despite the long shift. She'd been working at this upscale Manhattan restaurant for 6 months now, serving tech executives, Wall Street sharks, and old money families who treated $20 tips like pocket change. What none of them knew was that she had more degrees than most of them, including a PhD in economics from Harvard that she'd earned with honors. But today, like every other day, she played her part perfectly. The invisible service worker who cleaned up after the powerful while they discussed deals worth millions over their $100 steaks. Booth 7 had been occupied by Holden Kingsley and his usual entourage of sycophants for the past 2 hours. Brynn had served them countless times, always maintaining the perfect balance of attentiveness and invisibility that high-end service demanded. Kingsley never looked at her directly, never said please or thank you, treating her like a piece of furniture that occasionally brought him things. His platinum Patek Philippe watch caught the light as he gestured dismissively at whoever was speaking, and his tailored Armani suit probably cost more than most people made in 6 months. The 40-something tech mogul had built Kingsley Enterprises from a small software company into a global empire worth billions, and he wore his success like armor, impenetrable, cold, and designed to intimidate. As Brynn cleared the last table in her section, she noticed the crumpled $20 bill wedged between the leather cushions of booth 7. The table had been empty for 15 minutes, but Kingsley remained at his usual spot by the window, phone pressed to his ear as he conducted what sounded like a hostile takeover negotiation. His voice carried across the nearly empty dining room, sharp and calculating as he discussed eliminating redundancies and maximizing shareholder value, corporate speak for destroying people's livelihoods. Brynn's jaw tightened as she recognized the familiar language of corporate raiders, the same words that had been used to justify her father's company's destruction 3 years ago. She picked up the bill carefully, examining it for any identifying marks that might help her return it to its rightful owner. The money felt strange in her hands, too crisp for something that had been lost, too deliberately placed. She turned it over, noting a small pen mark in the corner that looked almost intentional. For 6 months, she'd been documenting everything she could about Kingsley's business dealings, sitting in nearby booths during her breaks to record conversations about insider trading, market manipulation, and the kind of corporate malfeasance that destroyed small companies like her father's. This $20 bill felt different somehow, like a signal she couldn't quite decode yet. She slipped it into her apron pocket, planning to turn it in to Lost and Found after her shift ended. The restaurant had strict policies about found money, and Brynn had never taken so much as a misplaced quarter in all her months working there. "Excuse me." Kingsley's voice sliced through the quiet like a blade. Brynn turned, her pulse immediately quickening at his tone. He'd ended his phone call and was staring at her with the kind of cold intensity that had probably intimidated countless boardrooms. "I saw you take something from that table." His words carried the weight of accusation, each syllable precisely enunciated and designed to establish dominance. The few remaining staff members in the dining room seemed to freeze, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere. Garrett Finch, the restaurant manager, emerged from the kitchen like he'd been summoned by some invisible signal, his face already showing the practiced concern of someone who dealt with wealthy customers' complaints for a living. Brynn's throat went dry as she felt the familiar sensation of being trapped between truth and perception. "I found some money in the booth cushions, sir. I was planning to turn it in to Lost and Found." Her voice remained steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She'd faced down thesis committees at Harvard, defended her research against skeptical professors, and presented findings to rooms full of economists. But standing here in her waitress uniform, facing down a man worth more than most small countries' GDP, she felt the familiar sting of powerlessness that came with service industry work. The $20 seemed to burn in her pocket like evidence of a crime she hadn't committed. Kingsley's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, searching for tells like a professional poker player. "That's an interesting story. The thing is, I placed exactly $160 on that table as a tip for my server. Now I only see $140. Simple math suggests you've helped yourself to the difference." His accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, poisoning the atmosphere with its implications. Garrett stepped closer, his face now showing genuine alarm as he realized the magnitude of what was being suggested. Other staff members had begun to gather at the edges of the dining room, drawn by the unmistakable tension of a confrontation that could destroy someone's career in minutes. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on Brynn, a billionaire accusing a waitress of stealing $20 while wearing a watch worth more than most people's annual salaries. But she understood the deeper game being played here. This wasn't about the money. It was about power, about establishing dominance, about ensuring that people like her stayed in their assigned places. Her research into Kingsley's business practices had taught her to recognize the patterns of a man who destroyed people for sport, who used his wealth and influence to crush anyone who threatened his carefully constructed empire. This confrontation felt like a test, like he somehow sensed that she was more than she appeared to be. "Mr. Kingsley," Garrett began, his voice carefully modulated to convey both respect for the customer and protection for his employee. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Brynn has been with us for 6 months and has never had any issues with—" Kingsley silenced him with a raised hand, his attention never leaving Brynn's face. The gesture was so casual, so automatically assumed to carry authority, that it revealed everything about how he moved through the world. He was a man accustomed to controlling every conversation, every outcome, every narrative. The idea that a mere waitress might challenge his version of events was clearly foreign to his experience. The glass walls of Kingsley's corner office on the 52nd floor offered a commanding view of Manhattan's skyline. But Holden's attention was focused entirely on the background check report spread across his mahogany desk. The preliminary information on Brynn Caldwell had arrived within hours of his call to his security team, and what he was reading didn't match the narrative of a simple waitress caught stealing. Born in Portland, Oregon, to middle-class parents, father a small business owner, mother a high school teacher. Full academic scholarship to Harvard, where she'd graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's degree in economics before completing her PhD in record time. Her dissertation on corporate malfeasance and market manipulation had won several prestigious awards and had been cited by federal regulators in recent policy papers. This wasn't the profile of someone desperate enough to steal $20 from a restaurant customer. Holden leaned back in his Italian leather chair, his mind racing through the implications of what he'd discovered. Tessa Vaughn, his executive assistant, entered the office carrying additional files and wearing the kind of efficient professionalism that had made her indispensable to his operation. She placed the documents on his desk with the precise movements of someone who'd learned to anticipate his needs before he voiced them. "The deep dive on Caldwell is complete," she said, her voice carrying just the right amount of deference mixed with competence. "It gets more interesting. She's been publishing research papers on corporate accountability for the past 2 years, specifically targeting companies with histories of hostile takeovers and questionable business practices." Her words carried a weight that made Holden's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The additional files revealed a pattern that set Holden's teeth on edge. Brynn Caldwell wasn't just an overqualified waitress. She was a potential threat operating under deep cover. Her academic work had focused specifically on companies like his, dissecting the methods used by corporate raiders to destroy smaller competitors and consolidate market power. Her most recent paper, published just 3 months ago, had examined the psychological profiles of executives who engaged in predatory business practices, and the language she'd used was uncomfortably specific. It was as if she'd been studying him personally, cataloging his methods and motivations with the precision of a behavioral scientist preparing to expose a specimen. The thought that she'd been serving him coffee while analyzing his conversation patterns made his skin crawl with a combination of rage and professional admiration. Meanwhile, across town in her modest Brooklyn apartment, Brynn sat surrounded by the fruits of 6 months of meticulous research. The walls were covered with printed articles, financial documents, and photographs that mapped out Kingsley Enterprises' corporate structure like a detective's murder board. String connected various pieces of evidence, creating a web that revealed the systematic destruction of smaller companies that had dared to compete with Kingsley's empire. At the center of it all was a photograph of her father, Thomas Caldwell, standing proudly in front of the small software company he'd built from nothing. The company that Holden Kingsley had acquired in a hostile takeover 3 years ago, stripped for parts and dissolved within 6 months of purchase, destroying her father's life's work and pushing him into a depression that had ultimately claimed his life. The $20 bills sat on her kitchen table like a piece of evidence she couldn't quite categorize yet. Something about its placement in the booth had felt intentional, too convenient to be accidental. She'd photographed it from every angle, noting the small pen mark in the corner that looked almost like a signal. Her academic training had taught her to question convenient coincidences, and this felt like something designed to draw her attention. As she reviewed the security camera footage from the restaurant, obtained through her friendship with one of the kitchen staff, she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Tessa Vaughn, Kingsley's assistant, had been in the restaurant an hour before his lunch meeting, sitting alone in the booth adjacent to his usual table. The timestamp showed her leaving exactly 20 minutes before Kingsley arrived, and the camera angle suggested she could have easily accessed booth 7 during that window. Back in his office, Holden was piecing together his own version of the puzzle. The background check had revealed that Thomas Caldwell had been the founder and CEO of Caldwell Innovations, a small but promising software company that had developed proprietary algorithms for data analysis. Holden remembered the acquisition clearly. It had been one of his more ruthless takeovers, designed not to integrate a competitor but to eliminate one. The company's technology had been valuable, but their market position had threatened one of Kingsley Enterprises' key revenue streams. The fact that Thomas Caldwell had died by suicide 8 months after losing his company wasn't something that had registered as significant at the time. Corporate casualties were an accepted part of doing business at Holden's level, collateral damage in the larger game of market domination. The realization that Brynn Caldwell was Thomas Caldwell's daughter hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't about $20 or even about theft. This was about revenge. She'd infiltrated his routine, positioned herself to observe his business practices, and was almost certainly gathering evidence for some kind of exposé or legal action. The thought that he'd been under surveillance for months by someone with both the motivation and intelligence to destroy him filled him with a cold rage that he hadn't felt since his early days building his empire. Every conversation in booth 7, every deal discussed over lunch, every casual comment about crushing competitors, all of it potentially recorded and analyzed by someone with a PhD in a personal vendetta. Tessa returned to his office with additional security footage from the restaurant, her face carefully neutral as she delivered news she knew would displease him. "The camera angles don't provide definitive proof about the origin of the money," she reported, her voice maintaining its professional tone despite the tension radiating from Holden's rigid posture. "But they do confirm that Ms. Caldwell had no prior interaction with booth 7 before finding the bill. If she placed it there herself, she's either extremely sophisticated in her planning or—" She let the sentence hang, knowing that Holden would fill in the implications himself. The possibility that someone else had planted the money as a signal or test was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The confrontation came 24 hours later, not in the restaurant, but in the parking garage beneath Brynn's apartment building. She'd sensed she was being followed since leaving her morning economics lecture at Columbia, where she'd been guest teaching a seminar on corporate accountability. The black Mercedes sedan had maintained a careful distance, but Brynn's 6 months of hypervigilance had taught her to recognize surveillance tactics. When Holden Kingsley stepped out of the vehicle, flanked by 2 security personnel who looked like they'd been recruited from military special forces, she felt her carefully constructed cover identity cracking like ice under pressure. The underground garage suddenly felt like a tomb, concrete walls closing in as the echo of expensive shoes on concrete announced her exposure. "Dr. Caldwell," Holden said, his voice carrying a mock formality that made her name sound like an accusation. "Or should I say, Brynn the waitress. I have to admit, your performance at Meridian was quite convincing. PhD from Harvard, published researcher, daughter of Thomas Caldwell. Yet, you've been serving me coffee for 6 months while pretending to be a struggling service worker. That takes a special kind of dedication to deception." His words were precise and calculated, each syllable designed to strip away the protective anonymity she'd carefully cultivated. The security guards remained silent but alert, their presence a clear reminder of the power dynamics at play in this encounter. Brynn straightened her spine, feeling her academic training kick in as she shifted from defensive to analytical mode. "I never claimed to be anything other than what you saw," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "You made assumptions based on my uniform and your own prejudices about service workers. The fact that you're shocked to discover I have an education says more about your worldview than it does about any deception on my part." She could see her words hitting their target, watching Holden's jaw tighten as she challenged the fundamental assumptions that governed his interactions with people he considered beneath him. The parking garage's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on his face, revealing the cold calculation behind his carefully maintained public persona. The conversation that followed felt like a chess match played at breakneck speed, each move revealing new layers of strategy and counter-strategy. Holden accused her of corporate espionage, of illegally recording private conversations, of planning some kind of sophisticated takedown of his business empire. Brynn responded with the precision of someone who'd spent years studying corporate law alongside her economics PhD, pointing out that public restaurants weren't private spaces, and that documenting potential securities violations was protected under whistleblower legislation. She watched his face change as he realized that she wasn't just intelligent. She was prepared, legally sophisticated, and potentially dangerous to everything he'd built. "You want to discuss illegal activities?" Brynn said, reaching into her bag to retrieve a small digital recorder. "Because I've been documenting your lunch conversations for 6 months. And some of what you've discussed would be very interesting to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Insider trading, market manipulation, coordinated attacks on competitors' stock prices. Should I continue?" The device seemed tiny in the vast concrete space, but its implications were enormous. She'd captured dozens of conversations where Holden had discussed business practices that violated federal securities laws. Conversations he'd assumed were private because he'd never considered that a waitress might be smart enough to understand their significance. Holden's reaction was swift and predictable. He offered money first, $100,000 to destroy the recordings and disappear. When Brynn refused, he shifted to threats, describing in detail how his legal team could destroy her academic career, how his connections in the publishing world could blacklist her research, how his influence could make her unemployable in any field related to economics or business. The threats felt like a physical assault, each word carefully chosen to remind her of the vast disparity in their resources and connections. But Brynn had expected this response, had prepared for it during months of studying his behavioral patterns. She knew that Holden Kingsley's first instinct was always to crush opposition rather than negotiate with it. "This isn't about money," Brynn said finally, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years of grief and anger. "This is about justice for my father and accountability for the hundreds of other people you've destroyed while building your empire. Thomas Caldwell wasn't just another corporate casualty to me. He was my father. And your predatory takeover of his company killed him as surely as if you'd put a gun to his head. I want the world to know what kind of man you really are, what kind of business practices you use, and what the human cost of your success has been." Her words seemed to echo in the concrete space, each syllable carrying the passion of someone who'd spent years preparing for this moment. The revelation transformed Holden's anger into something colder and more dangerous. He'd faced corporate rivals before, dealt with regulatory investigations and media exposés, but those had been business challenges fought with lawyers and public relations firms. This was personal vengeance carried out by someone with both the intelligence to threaten him and the moral conviction to see it through, regardless of the personal cost. As he looked at Brynn's determined face, illuminated by the harsh garage lighting, he realized that traditional intimidation tactics weren't going to work. She wasn't motivated by money or career advancement. She was driven by grief and justice, two forces that couldn't be bought or threatened into submission. "You have no idea what you're walking into," Holden said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more menacing than his earlier threats. "I didn't build a billion-dollar empire by letting graduate students with revenge fantasies destroy everything I've worked for. If you want to play this game, Dr. Caldwell, I'll play it. But understand that I don't lose. I don't compromise. And I don't leave enemies standing when the dust settles." His words carried the promise of total war, a complete mobilization of his resources against a single target. As he walked back to his Mercedes, leaving Brynn alone in the echoing garage, she understood that she'd crossed a point of no return. The investigation phase was over. The real battle was about to begin. The attacks began immediately and came from every direction Holden could leverage his vast network of influence. Within 48 hours of their parking garage confrontation, Brynn found herself effectively blacklisted from academic conferences where she'd been scheduled to present her research on corporate accountability. Journal editors who'd previously courted her papers suddenly stopped returning her calls, and the university where she'd been teaching guest seminars abruptly canceled her contract without explanation. The efficiency of the campaign was breathtaking in its scope. Holden was systematically destroying her professional reputation with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Each canceled opportunity felt like a small death, a piece of her carefully built academic career crumbling under the weight of corporate influence. Knox Whitman arrived at Brynn's apartment on a rainy Thursday evening, carrying takeout Chinese food and wearing the kind of grim expression that had earned him a reputation as one of New York's most tenacious civil rights attorneys. They'd known each other since law school, where Knox had been pursuing his JD while Brynn worked on her PhD, and their friendship had been built on late-night debates about corporate power and social justice. What Brynn didn't know, and what Knox was about to reveal, was that he'd spent 2 years working at Morrison, Sterling & Associates, the white shoe law firm that had handled several of Kingsley Enterprises' most controversial acquisitions. He'd left the firm in disgust after being asked to find legal justifications for what amounted to corporate theft, but not before copying files that documented systematic violations of antitrust and securities laws. "I should have told you earlier," Knox said as he spread the stolen documents across Brynn's kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly as he revealed the scope of what he'd discovered. "When you first mentioned Kingsley, I should have warned you what you were up against. But I thought you were just doing academic research, not planning to take him on directly. These files show that your father's company wasn't just acquired. It was specifically targeted for destruction because their technology threatened one of Kingsley's government contracts worth $300 million. The documents laid out a conspiracy that went far beyond simple corporate raiding, revealing a pattern of systematic fraud designed to eliminate competition through any means necessary. The files told a story of calculated malice that made Brynn's stomach turn. Her father's company hadn't been struggling when Kingsley targeted it. It had been on the verge of a major breakthrough that would have revolutionized data analysis for government agencies. Kingsley's team had infiltrated Thomas Caldwell's company for months before the takeover, stealing intellectual property and sabotaging key client relationships to create the appearance of financial distress. The hostile acquisition had been the final step in a plan designed not just to acquire valuable technology, but to eliminate the man who'd created it. Internal emails revealed that Kingsley had personally ordered the psychological pressure campaign that had pushed her father toward his final, desperate decision. As Knox explained the legal intricacies of what they'd uncovered, Brynn felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with horrible clarity. The $20 bill, Tessa Vaughn's presence at the restaurant, the convenient timing of Holden's accusation, everything had been orchestrated to create this moment of revelation. Someone inside Kingsley's organization was feeding her information, using her as a weapon against the man who destroyed her father. The realization should have filled her with hope, but instead it left her feeling manipulated and uncertain about whose game she was actually playing. The boundary between justice and revenge was becoming increasingly blurred as she understood the scope of the forces arrayed around her. Knox's proposal was both elegant and dangerous. They would build a federal case against Kingsley using the stolen documents combined with Brynn's recorded conversations and her academic research into his business patterns. The strategy would involve coordinated releases of information to financial journalists, strategic leaks to regulatory agencies, and a comprehensive legal assault designed to collapse Kingsley's empire from multiple directions simultaneously. But Knox was brutally honest about the risks. They would be going up against one of the most powerful men in America, someone with virtually unlimited resources and no moral constraints on how he fought his battles. The legal system that was supposed to protect whistleblowers had been systematically weakened by decades of corporate lobbying, and people who challenged billionaires had a tendency to face mysterious personal and professional catastrophes. The conversation was interrupted by a phone call that changed everything. Garrett Finch, the restaurant manager who'd witnessed the original $20 accusation, was calling to inform Brynn that she was being officially terminated for theft. Despite the lack of evidence and the obvious vindictive nature of the decision, Meridian's corporate ownership had apparently received pressure from influential investors to remove her immediately. The termination letter, which arrived by courier an hour later, was a masterpiece of legal language that destroyed her employment prospects while carefully avoiding any actionable defamation. Holden had turned her attempt to seek justice into grounds for branding her a criminal, using his influence to create a narrative that would follow her for years. But the termination letter also revealed something unexpected that made Knox smile for the first time all evening. The legal language was too sophisticated, too precisely crafted to have been written by restaurant management. This was the work of Morrison, Sterling & Associates, the same law firm where Knox had worked, the same firm whose internal ethics violations he'd documented extensively. The letter itself was evidence of coordination between Kingsley and his legal team to interfere with Brynn's employment, a pattern that could be used to demonstrate systematic retaliation against a potential whistleblower. In their haste to destroy her, they'd created additional evidence of the very conspiracy they were trying to hide. As the evening wore on, Knox and Brynn developed a battle plan that would have impressed any military strategist. They would use Holden's own aggressive tactics against him, turning his strength into weakness by forcing him to respond to attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Brynn would continue her academic research while Knox handled the legal strategy, and together they would coordinate with investigative journalists to ensure maximum public impact when their revelations were released. The goal wasn't just to expose Holden's crimes, but to create a template that other victims of corporate predators could follow. They were fighting for more than just justice for Thomas Caldwell. They were fighting to prove that ordinary people could still hold the powerful accountable when institutions failed them. The chapter ended with a moment that would have seemed mundane to any observer, but carried deep significance for both of them. As Knox gathered the scattered documents, preparing to leave, he noticed the photograph of Thomas Caldwell that Brynn kept on her kitchen counter. The image showed a proud man standing in front of his small company's modest headquarters, his face radiating the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd built something meaningful with his own hands. Knox had never met Thomas Caldwell, but looking at that photograph, he understood why his daughter was willing to risk everything to honor his memory and ensure his death hadn't been meaningless. The return to Meridian felt like stepping back into a crime scene where the evidence had been carefully rearranged. Brynn entered through the front door as a customer this time, her Harvard credentials and professional demeanor opening doors that her waitress uniform had kept closed. She'd made a reservation under her real name, Dr. Brynn Caldwell, and requested booth 7 specifically, the same booth where everything had started 3 weeks ago. The hostess, a young woman named Sarah, who'd worked alongside Brynn for months without knowing her true identity, did a double-take when she recognized her former colleague, dressed in an expensive business suit and carrying herself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect rather than serving others. The lunch crowd was its usual collection of Manhattan power players, but today Brynn saw them through different eyes. Instead of obstacles to navigate while balancing plates and taking orders, they were now subjects to study, their conversations potential intelligence to gather, their behaviors patterns to analyze and document. She'd positioned herself strategically to observe booth 7 while remaining hidden behind a decorative pillar, her smartphone configured to record audio while appearing to be simply checking emails. The transformation from service worker to investigator felt both liberating and deeply unsettling, as if she'd shed a disguise she'd worn so long it had become part of her identity. Holden arrived exactly on schedule, his punctuality as predictable as everything else about his carefully controlled routine. But today, something was different about his demeanor, a tension in his shoulders, a sharpness in his movements that suggested he knew he was being watched. Tessa Vaughn accompanied him, carrying herself with the same professional efficiency Brynn had observed dozens of times before. But there was something in her expression that hadn't been there during previous visits. An alertness, a hyper-awareness of her surroundings that seemed almost conspiratorial. As they settled into booth 7, Tessa's eyes swept the dining room and locked onto Brynn's position for just a moment, long enough to convey recognition and something that might have been approval. The conversation that followed shattered everything Brynn thought she knew about the game being played around her. Instead of the usual discussions about market positions and acquisition targets, Holden was detailing plans for a massive government contract fraud involving cybersecurity systems for federal agencies. The scope was staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts awarded based on falsified testing data and bribed officials. But what made Brynn's blood run cold wasn't the magnitude of the fraud, but Holden's casual mention of eliminating a potential whistleblower who discovered discrepancies in the testing protocols. The word eliminate carried implications that went far beyond corporate retaliation or legal intimidation. As the conversation continued, Brynn began to understand that she was witnessing something unprecedented. A moment when Holden's careful facade was completely dropping, revealing the ruthless criminal beneath the polished exterior. He spoke about human lives with the same casual indifference he used to discuss quarterly earnings, treating murder as just another business tool to be deployed when other methods proved insufficient. The recording device in her phone captured every word, documenting evidence that would destroy not just Holden's business empire, but potentially send him to federal prison for the rest of his life. The weight of what she was hearing pressed down on her like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe as she realized the true scope of the monster her father had encountered. Then came the moment that changed everything. Tessa Vaughn excused herself from the table, ostensibly to take a phone call, but instead of heading toward the restaurant's exit, she made her way directly to Brynn's booth. The approach was so bold, so openly defiant of standard covert operations protocol, that Brynn immediately understood she was dealing with someone who'd reached the end of their tolerance for deception and manipulation. Tessa slid into the booth across from her, with the fluid grace of someone who'd been planning this moment for months, her corporate mask finally slipping to reveal the determined activist underneath. "The $20 bill was my signal," Tessa said without preamble, her voice low but steady as she confirmed what Brynn had begun to suspect weeks ago. "I've been Holden's assistant for 3 years, and I've been documenting his crimes for 2 of them. When I learned about your father's case, I realized that you might be the catalyst we needed to finally bring him down. The money wasn't stolen. It was planted to create the confrontation that would force you to reveal your true identity and motivations." Her confession reframed everything that had happened, transforming what Brynn had believed was her own investigation into something far more sophisticated and coordinated. The files that Tessa produced from her designer handbag contained evidence that made Knox's stolen documents look like preliminary sketches compared to architectural blueprints. 3 years of internal communications, financial records, recorded phone calls, and photographic evidence of Holden's criminal enterprises spread across multiple industries and several continents. But the most devastating revelation was contained in a folder labeled Thomas Caldwell. Documentation that proved Holden had orchestrated not just the destruction of her father's company, but the psychological warfare that had driven him to suicide. Internal emails detailed a campaign of harassment, financial manipulation, and social isolation designed specifically to push Thomas Caldwell toward a mental breakdown that would discredit any potential testimony he might provide about stolen intellectual property. "Your father didn't just lose his company," Tessa explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd carried these secrets too long. "Holden destroyed him personally because Thomas had discovered evidence of the government contract fraud and was preparing to go to federal investigators. The suicide wasn't the tragic consequence of financial ruin. It was the intended outcome of a systematic campaign of psychological torture designed to silence a whistleblower. I have recordings of Holden bragging about breaking your father, about turning a respected businessman into a desperate man who chose death over continued humiliation." The words hit Brynn like physical blows, each revelation adding new dimensions to her grief and rage. As Tessa continued her explanation, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. She wasn't working alone. There was a network of people inside Kingsley Enterprises who'd become sickened by what they'd witnessed and were ready to risk everything to expose it. The $20 bill had been just the beginning, a test to see if Brynn had the intelligence and determination to follow the breadcrumbs that would lead her to this moment. Everything had been carefully orchestrated to create the conditions for a coordinated assault on Holden's empire, using Brynn's personal motivation and academic credentials as the public face of a much larger rebellion. The chapter ended with a moment of perfect clarity that felt like stepping out of fog into brilliant sunlight. As Tessa gathered her files and prepared to return to her performance as a loyal assistant, she handed Brynn a small device that looked like an ordinary pen but contained a sophisticated recording system. "Tomorrow, he's meeting with the federal officials he's been bribing," Tessa said, her voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone who'd finally found a way to fight back against power that had seemed invincible. "This is our chance to catch him in the act, to record him completing the crime that will bring down his entire operation. Are you ready to finish what your father started?" The war room that Knox had established in his law firm's conference room looked like something from a political thriller, with documents covering every surface and multiple laptops streaming financial data in real time. Brynn sat at the center of it all, feeling simultaneously empowered and overwhelmed as she watched her months of careful investigation crystallize into something that could actually challenge one of America's most powerful men. The evidence that Tessa had provided transformed their case from academic research into a federal criminal matter, complete with documentation of bribery, fraud, conspiracy, and now murder conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government contracting. The scope was so vast that Knox had brought in 2 additional attorneys to help process the legal implications. The pen device that Tessa had given her was more sophisticated than anything Brynn had expected, capable of recording high-definition audio through corporate meeting room walls and transmitting data in real time to secure servers. As she tested the equipment, she couldn't help but wonder about the network of people who'd made such technology available to a corporate assistant seeking to expose her boss. The device's sophistication suggested resources and planning that went far beyond what a single whistleblower could arrange, implying coordination with law enforcement agencies or other powerful interests that wanted to see Holden Kingsley destroyed. The realization that she was now part of something larger than her personal quest for justice was both thrilling and terrifying. The federal meeting that Tessa had described was scheduled for the following afternoon at Kingsley Enterprises corporate headquarters, taking place in a conference room that was supposedly swept for surveillance devices weekly. According to the intelligence Tessa had provided, Holden would be meeting with Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Marcus Webb and Treasury Department official Patricia Morrison to finalize the payment structure for their ongoing cooperation in the cybersecurity contract fraud. The meeting represented a perfect opportunity to capture definitive evidence of federal corruption, while documenting Holden's role as the orchestrating criminal mind behind a conspiracy that threatened national security. But as Knox explained the legal ramifications of what they were planning, the risks became increasingly clear. Recording federal officials without their consent could potentially violate multiple laws, even when documenting criminal activity. If their investigation was discovered before they could present evidence to prosecutors, they could find themselves facing charges more serious than anything they hoped to prove against Holden. The corporate espionage statutes that protected executives like Holden could also be used against people trying to expose them, creating a legal maze where the criminals were better protected than their victims. Knox's experience with federal prosecutors had taught him that they were often more interested in maintaining relationships with powerful defendants than in pursuing justice for ordinary victims. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Martinez, the FBI financial crime specialist whom Knox had contacted through back channels, arrived at their makeshift command center carrying authorizations that legitimized their entire operation. The Bureau had been investigating Kingsley Enterprises for over a year, building a case around the government contract fraud that had killed Thomas Caldwell, but they'd lacked the inside access necessary to prove the conspiracy's scope. Brynn's recordings and Tessa's documentation provided exactly the evidence they needed to move forward with a coordinated law enforcement action that would protect their witnesses while ensuring that justice was finally served. "Your father's death wasn't meaningless," Agent Martinez explained as she reviewed the evidence spread across the conference table. His company's technology contained embedded security features that would have revealed the fraudulent testing data Kingsley was using to secure government contracts. Thomas Caldwell didn't just threaten one deal. He threatened a criminal enterprise worth billions of dollars across multiple federal agencies. Killing him wasn't just about eliminating a whistleblower. It was about protecting a systematic corruption of America's national defense infrastructure. Her words gave Thomas Caldwell's death a significance that went beyond personal tragedy, transforming it into an act of national heroism that deserved appropriate recognition. The plan that emerged from their collaboration was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. Brynn would attend the federal meeting as a wire-wearing FBI informant, using her legitimate academic credentials to gain access to Kingsley Enterprises under the pretense of conducting research on corporate governance best practices. Tessa would ensure that she was positioned to observe and record the criminal conspiracy, while Knox and Agent Martinez coordinated the legal response that would protect all witnesses and ensure that the evidence was admissible in federal court. The timing would be crucial. They needed to capture the criminal act while maintaining the legal protections that would allow prosecution to proceed. As they finalized the operational details, Brynn felt a strange sense of peace settle over her anxiety. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of her father's death without understanding its true meaning or significance. Now she could see that Thomas Caldwell had died protecting American national security interests, that his refusal to compromise his professional integrity had made him a target for criminals who prioritized profit over patriotism. The investigation that had begun as personal revenge was transforming into something larger and more meaningful, an opportunity to honor her father's memory while protecting future victims of corporate predators who treated human lives as acceptable losses in their pursuit of power and wealth. The evening before the operation, Knox and Brynn shared a quiet dinner at the same restaurant where everything had begun, sitting in booth 7 and reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They were planning to destroy Holden Kingsley using the same booth where he'd tried to destroy Brynn's life over $20. The circular nature of the justice they were seeking felt almost poetic, as if the universe was finally balancing scales that had been tipped too far in favor of wealth and power for too long. But their quiet moment was shattered by news that changed everything. Tessa called with information that sent chills through both of them. Holden had discovered her role as an informant and was planning to flee the country immediately after the federal meeting concluded. Private jets were already fueled and waiting at 3 different airports, with false identity documents prepared for a journey that would take him beyond the reach of American law enforcement. The window for justice was closing rapidly, and if they failed to capture definitive evidence during tomorrow's meeting, Holden Kingsley would disappear forever, taking his secrets and his crimes with him into permanent exile among other wealthy fugitives who'd escaped accountability through money and connections. The realization that this might be their only opportunity transformed their careful plan into something more desperate and dangerous. Everything would have to work perfectly. The recording equipment, Tessa's positioning, Brynn's performance as an unsuspecting academic researcher, and the FBI's coordination of arrest and seizure warrants. One mistake, one moment of suspicion from Holden or his security team, and 3 years of investigation would culminate in complete failure. As Brynn prepared for what might be the most important performance of her life, she understood that she was carrying the hopes not just of her father's memory, but of every victim of corporate crime who'd never received justice because they'd lacked the resources to fight back against power that seemed insurmountable. The 52nd floor of the Kingsley Enterprises Tower felt like entering the lair of a predator who'd grown complacent from years of unchallenged power. Brynn moved through the marble and glass corridors with the measured confidence of an academic conducting legitimate research, her wire recording equipment hidden beneath layers of professional clothing and scholarly purpose. The FBI's technical team had outdone themselves in preparing her for this moment. The recording devices were undetectable even by military-grade scanning equipment, and her backup communications allowed Agent Martinez to monitor every word in real time from the building's parking garage. As she approached the executive conference room where Holden was meeting with his federal accomplices, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. The meeting was already in progress when Tessa guided her to an adjacent conference room under the pretense of reviewing corporate governance documents for her research project. Through the connecting door, which Tessa had deliberately left slightly ajar, they could hear every word of the criminal conspiracy unfolding 20 feet away. Deputy Undersecretary Webb's voice carried the nervous tension of someone who'd allowed greed to compromise his oath of office, while Treasury official Morrison spoke with the calculated precision of someone who'd turned corruption into a systematic business practice. But it was Holden's voice that dominated the conversation, casual and confident as he discussed bribes and falsified security testing data with the same tone he might use to order lunch. "The Caldwell situation taught us valuable lessons about managing whistleblower threats," Holden was saying, his words carrying implications that made Brynn's hands clench into fists despite her attempts to remain professionally detached. Sometimes, traditional corporate pressure isn't sufficient to ensure silence. Sometimes more permanent solutions are required to protect national security interests and maintain the integrity of our defense contracting relationships. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what he was really describing. The systematic murder of people who threatened to expose government corruption, presented as patriotic necessity rather than criminal conspiracy. Webb's response revealed the depth of the corruption they were documenting. The suicide was perfectly handled. No investigation, no awkward questions from oversight committees, no disruption to our ongoing operations. If we encounter similar problems with other potential whistleblowers, we'll know how to proceed. His casual dismissal of Thomas Caldwell's death as a successful operation rather than a human tragedy demonstrated how completely these men had abandoned any pretense of serving the public interest. They were discussing American citizens as if they were enemy combatants to be eliminated rather than public servants sworn to protect. As the meeting continued, Morrison produced financial documents that outlined the scope of their criminal enterprise with breathtaking audacity. Hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent government contracts, systematic bribery of federal officials across multiple agencies, and falsified security certifications that left American military and intelligence operations vulnerable to foreign attack. The cybersecurity systems that Kingsley was providing to protect national secrets were deliberately compromised, containing backdoors that could be accessed by hostile, foreign governments in exchange for additional payments that bypassed congressional oversight. Completely. What had begun as corporate fraud had evolved into something approaching treason on a scale that threatened fundamental national security interests. The moment of truth came when Holden began detailing his plans for handling the Caldwell daughter situation, with the same methodical planning he'd used to destroy her father. He'd identified Brynn's academic research, her connection to Knox Whitman, and even Tessa's role as a potential security breach. His solution was characteristically direct. Another, suicide that would eliminate the threat while providing a cautionary tale for other potential whistleblowers. The casual efficiency with which he planned her murder, discussing logistics and timing as if arranging a business dinner, revealed the complete absence of conscience that had enabled his criminal empire to flourish for years without meaningful challenge. But Holden's confidence proved to be his fatal weakness. As he outlined his plans for eliminating Brynn and Tessa, he was simultaneously providing FBI surveillance teams with detailed confessions to multiple federal crimes, including conspiracy to commit murder and systematic violation of national defense security protocols. The recording devices captured not just his words, but the supportive responses from Webb and Morrison, documenting a level of government corruption that would dominate headlines for months and potentially reshape how federal contracting oversight functioned. Agent Martinez later described it as the most comprehensive evidence package she'd ever assembled for a federal prosecution. The confrontation shifted into its final phase, when building security alerted Holden that FBI teams had surrounded the tower and were preparing to execute arrest warrants for everyone in the conference room. His response revealed both his desperation and his complete disconnection from normal human emotions. Instead of attempting to flee or negotiate, he demanded that Tessa bring Brynn into the main conference room so he could resolve the situation permanently before law enforcement gained access. The request was so obviously criminal that even Webb and Morrison began to distance themselves, recognizing that their accomplice had become a liability that threatened their own survival. Brynn's entrance into that conference room was the moment when all pretenses finally collapsed completely. Holden looked at her with the kind of cold hatred she'd only seen in documentaries about serial killers, his facade of corporate respectability replaced by something primitive and dangerous. "Dr. Brynn Caldwell," he said, her name dripping with venom and barely controlled rage. "Thomas Caldwell's little girl, all grown up and ready to follow in Daddy's footsteps right into an early grave. Did you really think you could destroy everything I've built with your amateur investigation and righteous indignation? Did you think I wouldn't recognize the same stubborn stupidity that made your father such a persistent problem?" The speech that followed was Brynn's moment of triumph. 3 years of grief and anger channeled into words that cut through Holden's arrogance like a surgeon's scalpel. She spoke about justice and accountability, about the hundreds of victims his criminal enterprise had created, about the national security threats he'd enabled for personal profit. But most powerfully, she spoke about her father, not as a victim, but as a hero who died protecting American interests against domestic enemies who wore expensive suits and hid behind corporate respectability. Her voice carried the moral authority of someone who'd sacrificed everything to honor a father's memory and ensure his death contributed to something meaningful rather than being forgotten as corporate collateral damage. The FBI's entry into the conference room was precisely choreographed, with Agent Martinez leading a team that had been monitoring every word and was prepared for any resistance Holden might attempt. The arrests were swift and professional, but the real victory was in watching Holden's complete psychological collapse as he realized that his wealth and connections couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was experiencing powerlessness, facing people who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated into submission. The man who'd built an empire by destroying others was finally confronting the reality that justice, while delayed, had finally arrived to balance scales that had been tipped in his favor for far too long. 6 months after the arrests that had dominated every major news network for weeks, Brynn stood in the spacious office that bore her name on the door, the Thomas Caldwell Foundation for Corporate Accountability. The irony wasn't lost on her that the foundation's headquarters were located in a building that had once housed one of the companies Holden Kingsley had destroyed during his decades-long criminal career. The seized assets from Kingsley Enterprises had provided more than enough funding to create a permanent institution dedicated to supporting whistleblowers, investigating corporate crime, and providing legal assistance to people fighting against predatory business practices. Agent Martinez had described it as the most comprehensive asset forfeiture in FBI history, turning the profits of corruption into resources for justice. The federal trial had been a media sensation that reshaped public understanding of corporate crime and government corruption. Holden's conviction on 17 federal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, treason, and systematic bribery of government officials had resulted in a life sentence without possibility of parole. Deputy Undersecretary Webb and Treasury official Morrison had received sentences of 25 and 30 years respectively, their cooperation with prosecutors earning them minor reductions that still ensured they would die in federal prison. But perhaps more importantly, the trial had exposed the systematic vulnerabilities in government contracting oversight that enabled criminals like Holden to operate with impunity for years before being discovered. Tessa Vaughn had emerged from the investigation as something of a folk hero, her 3-year undercover operation inspiring a generation of corporate insiders to speak out against the criminal enterprises they witnessed from within. The Witness Protection Program had relocated her to a new identity and career, but not before she'd testified before Congress about the need for stronger whistleblower protections and systematic reform of how federal contracts were awarded and monitored. Her courage in maintaining her cover while gathering evidence had provided a template for other potential informants, proving that ordinary employees could successfully challenge even the most powerful corporate criminals when they had proper support and legal protection. Knox Whitman had parlayed his role in the investigation into a new career as a federal prosecutor specializing in corporate crime, his insider knowledge of how white-collar defense attorneys operated making him devastatingly effective at dismantling the legal strategies that typically protected wealthy criminals. His first case as a prosecutor had resulted in the conviction of Morrison, Sterling, and Associates partners who'd facilitated Holden's criminal enterprise, and he'd become a nationally recognized expert on the intersection between corporate law and organized crime. The legal precedents established during the Kingsley prosecutions were already being used to pursue similar cases across the country. Brynn's academic career had transformed in ways she couldn't have imagined during her months serving coffee and documenting crimes in Booth 7. Her research on corporate accountability had become required reading in business schools and law schools, her first-hand experience providing insights that purely theoretical work couldn't match. Harvard had offered her a full professorship with tenure, but she'd chosen instead to divide her time between the foundation and guest lecturing at universities where her message could reach the next generation of business leaders before they became corrupted by systems that rewarded criminal behavior over ethical conduct. The return to Meridian Restaurant felt like completing a circle that had begun with her father's death and encompassed 3 years of careful planning and investigation. She entered not as a waitress or even as a customer, but as the director of a foundation that had already helped dozens of whistleblowers expose corporate crimes and receive protection for their courage. Garrett Finch, the manager who'd fired her 6 months ago, greeted her with the kind of nervous respect reserved for people whose phone calls were now returned immediately by federal prosecutors and congressional committee chairpersons. The restaurant had added a small plaque near Booth 7 commemorating Thomas Caldwell and other victims of corporate violence, a gesture that felt both inadequate and deeply meaningful. The symbolic moment came when she left a $20 tip for her server, not the crumpled bill that Tessa had planted to initiate their investigation, but a crisp new note that represented everything the original $20 had symbolized about assumptions, prejudices, and the power dynamics that governed interactions between different social classes. The young woman serving her table was a graduate student working her way through Columbia's journalism program, and Brynn made sure to leave her foundation's business card along with encouragement to contact them if she ever encountered stories about corporate misconduct that needed investigation and legal support. The afternoon brought an encounter that perfectly illustrated how the Foundation's work was creating ripple effects throughout the corporate world. A nervous young man approached her table, introducing himself as David Chen, a financial analyst at Morrison Dynamics who'd discovered evidence of accounting fraud that was being used to hide massive executive bonuses while the company laid off hundreds of workers. His hands shook as he described the retaliation he was already facing for asking questions about discrepancies in the financial reports. But his voice carried the determination of someone who'd been inspired by the Kingsley prosecution to believe that justice was possible even against seemingly impossible odds. As Brynn listened to David's story, she felt the familiar surge of purpose that had sustained her through months of danger and investigation. Each new case brought the opportunity to honor her father's memory while preventing other families from experiencing the grief and injustice that had shaped her adult life. The foundation had processed over 200 initial inquiries from potential whistleblowers in its first 6 months of operation, and each case represented both an opportunity for justice and evidence that corporate crime remained a systematic problem requiring sustained attention from people willing to risk personal safety for public good. The chapter's conclusion brought Brynn back to her foundation office as the sun set over Manhattan, casting golden light across the photograph of Thomas Caldwell that held the place of honor on her desk. The image showed a proud man standing in front of his company's headquarters, representing everything that was noble about American entrepreneurship and innovation. But now she understood that his legacy extended far beyond the technology he'd created or the business he'd built. His refusal to compromise his integrity, even in the face of psychological torture designed to break him, had planted seeds that ultimately flowered into justice for hundreds of victims and systemic reforms that would protect future generations from corporate predators. As she prepared to leave for the evening, Brynn's assistant handed her a package that had arrived by courier. No return address, but the kind of expensive stationery that suggested its sender was someone with significant resources. Inside was a single $20 bill and a note written in elegant handwriting. For Thomas Caldwell's daughter, from someone who understands that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. Your father would be proud of what his legacy has become. The identity of the sender would remain a mystery, but the message was clear. Their work was being noticed and appreciated by people who couldn't reveal themselves, but wanted to ensure that the fight for corporate accountability continued with proper support and recognition. The story concluded with Brynn's understanding that her father's death had not been the end of something, but the beginning of a movement that would outlive all of them. Every whistleblower they protected, every criminal they helped expose, every family they prevented from experiencing corporate victimization was a victory that honored Thomas Caldwell's memory while building toward a future where wealth couldn't purchase immunity from justice. As she turned off the lights in her foundation office, she felt her father's presence not as grief for what was lost, but as hope for what was still possible when ordinary people refused to accept that power and money placed anyone above the law.